There's the organization called the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program, and that they have a story here. And because of this, the team they went out just 2 days ago, and they were here for a week for monitoring of wolf and checking anything based on wolf.
Alright, hello everyone. That was my trip trekking in the Bale Mountains in Ethiopia. I will take a few minutes here to talk about some of the basics of doing the trekking here. So if this is something you're potentially interested in yourself, hang around and hopefully this will be helpful for you. I will start with the very basics, getting the visa for Ethiopia. Actually, I feel kind of sad to say after all the traveling I've done that this is the first time going to Ethiopia. But anyway, it was an easy visa to get. Of course, I'm from USA, though I think almost every country except for a few in East Africa do require a visa. I was able to get a visa online. It only took about 2 days for return, although there is a visa on arrival at Addis Ababa airport. I think total cost was $62. Getting the visa online, the only documents I needed were a copy of the passport and then a passport photo. The only other requirement I found, and I'm not sure where this is written, but when I was checking in for the flight to Ethiopia in Istanbul, they did ask for proof of onward travel. Now, I did meet another guy just recently there who said he didn't have any onward ticket. So I'm not certain about this, but it's something you might want to have just to be safe. Getting the e-visa online, the only option that was available at the time was 30 days, although I do see a portal online to extend that visa. If there's anyone who has experience with that, please let us know in the comments. Also, depending on what countries you're coming from, a yellow fever certificate may be required. Typically, this pertains to areas in sub-Saharan Africa. Although, as for me, I was coming from the other direction and I was not asked for this. Okay, next. Trekking season in Ethiopia typically runs from October until around March. Now, I did this in October 2024, and as you probably just saw, the weather was quite wet. I don't know if that's still normal at this time of year. We had like 1/2 day during the whole trip of sun. Though I did stay in Ethiopia till mid-November, and I did notice by the time that I left that it was considerably sunnier and less cloudy than when I had arrived. Also, it's my understanding that near the end of the dry season, around February or March, it gets quite brown and hazy. So given that, I'm happy to be here while it was still green, even if it did mean a little bit of rain. Okay, getting to the Bale Mountains. The nearest city is Robe, and when I was in Addis, I stayed at Mad Vervet Backpackers, which I think is the only backpacking hostel in the city. And I remember first arriving asking them, and this is unfortunate that so few people were going there, that they didn't even have a lot of advice for me getting there. But I did find out afterward that there is either a bus or a flight that you can take. It's really not hard at all to get there. I did opt for the flight, which was quite cheap. Starting price was around $100, but there are several discounts available. For example, If you have an international flight booked with Ethiopian Airlines, you'll get a discount on the domestic flights. Also, if you go through any of the touring agencies, you can get a big discount as well. Now, I did get a discount through one of the touring agencies out of Addis, which I don't recommend using, and I'll talk about that in my next video in the Simian Mountains. But anyway, I ended up paying about $50 for the tickets each way. Your other option would be to take the bus, which costs around $11, and I do believe should take around 10 or 11 hours. Although I didn't use it, I met a guy in Addis who said he left Robe around 6 in the morning, and I saw him back in Addis around 5. Now from Robe, it was a 30-minute drive, about 30 minutes over to Disnsho, which is where the National Park office is located and also where the trek begins. Now, when I was in Addis, I met someone who put me in direct contact with a guide, so he was nice enough to pick me up at the airport, and that part was all taken care of for me. Now, on the topic of going with a guide, this is a big gray area because there's so much conflicting information out there. Do you need a guide or not? Honestly, I don't know. I didn't think much about it, and there are several reasons why, but the primary one is the Ethiopian government does have some regulations involving commercial filming and drone flying also. And even if they don't apply to me specifically, if I'm walking around in the national park with a camera, it does draw a lot of negative attention to myself. It does make me suspicious. And the guide even told me as much. For example, at one point he saw the microphone on the camera and he said, "You might have to put that away if we're around the park ranger." But he said, "I'll keep an eye out for you and otherwise you'll be fine." In addition to that, there weren't a lot of maps available for this trek. Even the GPS source maps don't have a lot of information. There were some tracks available on Wikiloc, and I did my own map on Alltrails, and I'll leave that in the description as well. But even if a guide weren't required, I'm pretty certain you're still required to have the escort with you anytime you're in the national park. Now, generally speaking, I prefer to work without a guide. For one thing, the costs of trekking here in Ethiopia were starting to add up on me. Another one is I simply like to walk at my own pace most of the time. For example, we're starting here sometimes around 9 o'clock or later. Meanwhile, the sun rises at 6. To me, that's always kind of weird. Like the minute the sun is up, personally, I'm ready to go. Sometimes even before the sun is up. But having said all that, the guide, his name was Mohammed. I'll leave his contact as well in the description. I was told beforehand that he was used to working with photographers, so shouldn't have any problems. Obviously was the case. He not only was very patient with me setting up shots, but he also offered a lot of input on it of his own. Yeah, definitely couldn't ask for anything better in that regard. All right, what's the safety situation like in Ethiopia at the moment? Aside from seeing the travel advisory warning, reconsider travel, I didn't get a whole lot of specific information other than the fact that a lot of the danger was in the north of the country. Now, ever since 2020, tourism here has been quite low, and it is unfortunate. Specifically in the south, in Bale Mountains, where I was in this video, not a lot of safety concerns other than your normal travel precautions in this part of the world. In my next video on the Simian Mountains, I'll talk more about the specifics in that region. But yeah, again, it's unfortunate because coming to Bale Mountains, not really too much to be worried about. So I hope more people were able to come here. Another note concerning drones, although I did bring mine into the country without any problems, I did read in a blog somewhere that someone had theirs confiscated and then held at customs until they came back to exit the country. And even so, I wasn't able to fly it. There are permits required, and to my understanding, they're quite expensive. So I didn't even try. And then when I was leaving the country, The airport security caught it and asked me a few questions and then let me go on my way. But unless you're willing to apply for the permit and then go through that process, probably not worth coming here with a drone. Okay, on to the actual trek. Although I did spend a total of 5 days in the Bale Mountains, or 6 days if you count the arrival day. The actual trek was only 3 days of point-to-point trekking, and the 4th day was a side trip to a lake. And then on the last day was a short drive over to the highest point in the region, Tulu Dimtu. And then from there, just a short walk up to the peak. Actually, this was the easiest trek I've done in quite a long time. The entire trip was kind of like a gradual uphill. There were no major downhills. And I think the typical days were in between 15 to 20K. And I don't think even carrying the camera around with me, I think the longest I ever walked was maybe 5.5 hours in one day. So quite relaxed pace. Definitely was a nice break having horses carry all the equipment. Forgot how easy it was when you're not carrying a heavy pack with you. Although I did have all my own gear with me and definitely preferred to use that. If you're not traveling with your own equipment, tent and sleeping bag for example, they will be able to provide that for you as well. The only difficulty concern you want to keep in mind is that the altitude here is fairly high. The trip started around 3,100 meters at Disnsho. The first night we camped around 3,500, and then the second night around 3,900, and then the last 2 nights at Saneti Lodge were around 4,100. So if you're not already acclimatized, that is something that you want to keep in mind. Now for the arrival day, the itinerary was to spend a few hours wildlife spotting. For example, the Ethiopian Nyala, as well as warthogs, are quite easy to find around the Disnsho Lodge. Unfortunately, my morning flight was delayed till the afternoon, so I had only a short time window to go spotting for wildlife, but still was quite easy to see a lot of things. Actually, the first day of the trek, we spent a lot of time walking outside of the national park, which actually was pretty neat because it was just a lot of local farms. And I definitely enjoyed how much even a few hundred meters of altitude difference could really change the different flora and fauna that you see. Now the same thing applies here that applies to a lot of the places in Africa, is that all the African highlands have a very isolated flora and fauna system. Like you find a lot of plants and animals here that you don't see anywhere else in the world. For example, like Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya, Rwenzori Mountains in Uganda, Congo, Rwanda. So many different kind of wildlife that you don't see anywhere else. I think that's one of the best things about coming here. Of course, another one of the big draws of the Bale Mountains National Park is the Ethiopian wolves. Even though I did see one in Simeon from a distance, much easier to find them here. Although I definitely do wish I had a lens with a longer focal length. It would have helped me a ton on this trip, especially given that we have horses to carry the heavy stuff. Yeah, if I had to come back and do this again, I definitely would have brought a better lens. Spot the wolves, but also spot some of the birds here. Another thing definitely worth mentioning was that the audio track from this film was easily the best I've ever had. Like, aside from the heavy winds drowning out a lot of the bird sounds, it was like constant morning, afternoon, and night. You're listening to birds. Really was a cool part of the experience here. I was told that there are about 500 of the Ethiopian wolves left, or at least in this national park. And I think I spotted about 6 of them, so I felt good about that. Spending the first night in Sodota Camp, around 3,500 meters. There is a little shelter there, which is used by the conservation teams to monitor the wolves. And then we had access to a small hut on the side, which was, well, one, nice to get us out of the rain, but also there was solar power there available. While the temperatures here were quite comfortable during the day, especially on the few occasions when the sun was out, during the night it was getting down close to freezing, so do be prepared for that. On the second day we trekked from Sodota Camp to Wassama Camp. It was about 16K in total and was actually a little bit shorter than the first day. I think the first day was around 19K, and I think the second day actually was probably the most challenging of the 3 trekking days, although I certainly wouldn't say that it was particularly difficult. I thought all of the trekking days were quite easy. So we started around 3,500 and then ended the day around 3,900 meters, so it still wasn't a huge change in elevation. But it seems like the plant life and animals as well change even with the slightest change in elevation here. And this probably was the most scenic of all 3 days. I definitely enjoyed the scenery on this day. The second night, camping at Wassama, as I just mentioned, is around 3,900 meters. Now this was the only wild camp that we stayed at during the trek. No facilities here. And oh, I remember how cold it was that evening. Now this has a lot to do with the weather just being in general bad, but we were having soup after dark and I couldn't get through more than a few spoonfuls of soup before the soup felt like it was cold already. So yeah, again, do be prepared for the cold. Now the third day of the trek, walking from Wassama Camp to Saneti Lodge. Definitely the most boring of the 3 days, and this probably has a lot to do with the weather being so bad as well. But in the morning there was a little uphill through a valley up to the Saneti Plateau, and after that it was like several hours of just walking on this plateau. Might have been a different experience had the weather been better, but as it was, we were just putting our heads down and walking for most of the day. We spent the third night camped at Saneti Lodge, and then the fourth night as well also stayed at that lodge. And then just like the first night at Sodota, there was a small hut as well as some solar power. So it was enough electricity to charge my phone and then camera batteries as well. One of the real nice things about camping in this area though is that all the lakes brought the birds and particularly ducks around. So that evening did have a little bit of nice weather and actually had a real relaxing time walking around. And the fourth day was another day for wildlife spotting. We just took a short trip over to a lake. It was about 11K round trip, and then we were back at Saneti Lodge in time for lunch. But again, it was an enjoyable day. There were, of course, namely ducks, but plenty of other birds around the lake. So yeah, especially if you're looking for something just relaxing and don't want something challenging, yeah, it was definitely a nice walk. And then the last day we made the drive from Saneti Lodge over to Tulu Dimtu, the highest point in the region. And again, there was so much fog on the summit we couldn't see anything, unfortunately. And actually the vehicle was perfectly capable of driving to the top, but we got out and walked a short distance just for the sake of making a video. Like I mentioned earlier, Mohammed, the guide, was very much into helping me with the filming, so he had no problem walking this section. I have read some itineraries online that include this mountain Tulu Dimtu as part of the trek. I think rather than going to Saneti Lodge first, they go to Tulu Dimtu en route to Saneti. In hindsight, however, the way we did it, I'm quite happy with. Especially after the third day of the trek, walking on Saneti Plateau, it felt like it just went on for hours with more and more of the same thing. So didn't really need to see more of it, and I'm happy with the way our itinerary went in the end. Anyway, I hope you found this short guide helpful. As always, I'd love to hear your feedback. So if there's any questions, any comments, anything that I forgot to cover, please let me know. I will address it. And also, if you enjoy these guides, I'll be happy to make more of them in the future. So, all right, till next time, bye.